2.5 million years ago, the sun is setting over the Afar Depression in what we now call Ethiopia. A small group of Homo habilis is crouched over the remains of a medium-sized antelope. There is no smell of wood smoke, no crackle of dry grass, and no flint striking steel. There is only the wet, rhythmic sound of heavy volcanic stones striking bone, and the tearing of fibrous, cold muscle. You have been told the story of fire, the great catalyst of human civilization. But that story is missing its first 2 million years. We like to think of our ancestors as masters of the flame, but for the vast majority of our evolutionary journey, we were something far more alien to our modern sensibilities. We were the masters of the raw, the architects of a lifestyle that would kill a modern human in a matter of weeks. We tend to look at the pre-fire era as a period of waiting, a dark age before the lights were turned on. But that is the first and perhaps the most dangerous myth we have to dismantle. Everything you've been told about the natural human diet is probably backwards. We are often sold a romanticized version of the paleo lifestyle, a world of clean, lean proteins and wild berries that supposedly represents our biological peak. But if you were actually dropped into the Great Rift Valley 2 million years ago, you wouldn't find a health-conscious paradise. You would find a brutal, calorie-starved reality where every meal was a gamble against parasites and a mechanical struggle against biology itself. The idea that eating raw was somehow easier or more natural for us is our first major misconception. In reality, before fire, eating was the single most difficult job a hominin had. It was an exhausting, multi-hour physical labor that shaped our faces, our guts, and our brains long before the first ember was ever tamed. But if the raw diet was so incredibly difficult, how did we manage to thrive for millions of years without a single cooked calorie? The second myth we need to take down is the idea that meat eating and fire go hand in hand. There is a common narrative that humans only started eating significant amounts of meat once we could roast it over a pit. The archaeological record says otherwise, and it says it quite loudly. At sites like Gona and Bori in Ethiopia, researchers like Seleshi Sema have uncovered stone tools, simple Oldowan choppers, right alongside animal bones that bear unmistakable cut marks. These bones date back roughly 2.5 to 2.6 million years. Fire, meanwhile, doesn't become a consistent, routine part of the human toolkit until much later, with conservative estimates placing widespread use at around 400,000 years ago. This means that for over 2 million years, our ancestors were dedicated, systematic consumers of raw meat. They weren't just eating it, they were specializing in it. But how do you actually process a raw zebra leg with nothing but a sharp rock and a set of molars? This brings us to a mechanical reality that is almost impossible for a modern person to grasp. Raw muscle is not the tender steak you see in a plastic-wrapped tray. It is a dense, rubbery matrix of collagen and elastic fibers that is notoriously difficult to break down. When you cook meat, heat denatures those proteins and turns tough collagen into gelatin, essentially doing half the work of digestion for you. Without that heat, the work falls entirely on your jaw. Richard Wrangham, a biological anthropologist at Harvard, has argued extensively that raw meat is so mechanically demanding that a hominin would have had to spend the better part of their day just chewing to extract enough energy to survive. We see this reflected in the fossil record. Early species like Australopithecus and even early Homo had massive, powerful jaw muscles and teeth with thick enamel designed for grinding through incredibly tough material. But what if the meat wasn't the hardest thing they had to chew? There is a persistent belief that before fire, our ancestors were primarily gatherers who occasionally found a bit of meat. While it's true that plant matter made up a huge portion of the diet, the myth here is that these plants were the soft, succulent fruits and vegetables we eat today. They weren't. Before fire, the primary plant-based energy source for hominins in the African savanna was likely underground storage organs, or USOs. These are things like tubers, corms, and rhizomes, nature's version of a raw potato, but far more fibrous and often laced with toxins. Raw starch is a crystalline structure that the human body is remarkably bad at processing. If you eat a raw potato today, much of that starch passes through you undigested because your enzymes can't get past the molecular armor of the plant cells. Fire solves this through gelatinization, making the starch accessible. Before fire, hominins had to rely on mechanical processing. They would pound these tubers with stones, mashing them into a pulp to break the cell walls manually. It was cooking without heat, a labor-intensive process of pre-digestion that required both tools and time. But was the energy return actually worth the effort? This leads us to one of the most famous and debated theories in human evolution, the expensive tissue hypothesis, proposed by Leslie Aiello and Peter Wheeler in 1995. The myth here is that our brains just grew larger because we were smart enough to need them. Biology doesn't work that way. Brain tissue is metabolically expensive. It burns a massive amount of calories just to stay idling. To grow a bigger brain, an organism has to pay for it by shrinking another energy-hungry organ. In humans, that organ is the gut. Compared to other primates of our size, we have a tiny digestive tract. The common assumption is that fire allowed our guts to shrink because cooked food is so easy to digest. However, the archaeological evidence of brain expansion in Homo erectus predates the evidence for widespread fire. This suggests that the transition to a high-quality raw diet, specifically one rich in animal fats and marrow, was what initially funded the expansion of the human mind. Raw meat and marrow are far more calorie-dense than raw tubers. By using stone tools to access bone marrow, a substance that is essentially pure, shelf-stable fat, early humans found a way to cheat the caloric limits of a raw world. Does that mean we were the undisputed kings of the savannah, hunting down game at will? That is another myth we have to dismantle. We have this image of the early human as a mighty hunter, a spear-wielding athlete taking down mammoths. But for millions of years, we were likely something much more humble, the power scavenger. We weren't the ones making the kill. We were the ones waiting for the lions and leopards to finish. This is where the raw diet gets truly horrifying by modern standards. In a world without fire, fresh is a relative term. If you find a carcass that was killed yesterday, you are still going to eat it. This means early hominins were regularly consuming meat that was in various stages of bacterial decomposition. To do this without dying of food poisoning, our ancestors possessed a physiological trait that we have largely forgotten: incredible stomach acidity. A study by Deanna Beasley in 2015 pointed out that humans have a stomach pH that is remarkably low, more similar to that of scavengers like vultures and hyenas than to other primates. This high acidity is a biological filter, a pathogen-killing vat of acid designed to neutralize the Salmonella, E. coli, and Listeria that lived on the raw, aging meat of the Pliocene. We didn't survive the raw world because it was clean. We survived it because we were built like biological incinerators. Could we still survive that way today? Or have we lost that internal fire? The myth of the perfect raw diet persists in modern health circles, with many claiming that a raw-only lifestyle is the pinnacle of human health. But modern studies on raw foodists tell a different story. Research has shown that humans living on a 100% raw diet in the modern world struggle to maintain body weight and often suffer from chronic energy deficiencies. In women, this often leads to the cessation of the reproductive cycle. This proves that modern humans have become obligate cookers. We have evolved so far down the path of processed, heat-treated food that our bodies can no longer extract enough energy from a completely raw diet to support our large brains and active lives. The pre-fire diet wasn't a choice. It was a grueling, high-risk survival strategy that kept our species on the knife edge of extinction for eons. It was a world of parasites, tooth wear, and constant caloric anxiety. But if meat and tubers were so difficult, what about the food that didn't fight back? This brings us to the most underrated part of the pre-fire menu: insects. We tend to think of bug eating as a starvation food or a gross out challenge, but for the vast majority of human history, insects were a staple. They are the ultimate raw food. They are packed with protein and essential fats, they don't require fire to be safe or digestible, and they can be gathered by everyone from a small child to an elder. Jane Goodall and other primatologists have shown that chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, will spend hours fishing for termites with sticks. Early hominins likely did the same, but with even greater sophistication. Termites, grubs, and ants provided a steady, reliable base load of calories that meat and tubers couldn't always guarantee. In a pre-fire world, an anthill wasn't a nuisance. It was a high-fat vending machine. Why then do we focus so much on the big game hunter and so little on the insect gatherer? Probably because the story of the hunt is more dramatic, but it ignores the reality of seasonal scarcity. In the dry seasons of ancient Africa, the raw world became even more unforgiving. Fruits disappeared and game became lean and stringy. During these periods, the strategic knowledge of the environment became the most valuable tool in the kit. Early humans had to know exactly which roots held water, which insects were in season, and which carcasses were still safe enough to scavenge. This wasn't just instinct, it was a massive cognitive load. This brings us to a unifying truth that redefines the entire pre-fire era. We often think that fire made us smart, but the reality is that the sheer difficulty of surviving on a raw diet is what forced us to become smart in the first place. Fire didn't create the human mind. It was the reward for a mind that had already mastered the impossible art of living in a raw world. But was fire really the only way to cook something? There is a final, subtle myth to dismantle. The idea that raw meant unprocessed. While fire is the most famous way to chemically change food, it isn't the only way. For hundreds of thousands of years before the first hearth, humans were likely using cold cooking techniques. Fermentation is the most prominent example. If you leave fruit or certain plant materials in a container, even a simple hide or a hollowed-out log, it will begin to ferment. This process uses bacteria and yeast to break down tough fibers and neutralize toxins, effectively cooking the food without heat. Similarly, marinating meat in acidic fruit juices or pounding it with stones to break down muscle fibers are forms of processing that make nutrients more accessible. The pre-fire world wasn't a world of people just biting into things. It was a world of people using their brains to manipulate the chemistry of their food, using every tool except heat. If we could look back at a group of Homo erectus, we wouldn't see simple animals. We would see a group of expert food technicians working within the strictest constraints imaginable. Can we even begin to imagine the sensory reality of that life? The sensory world of the pre-fire human would be completely unrecognizable to us. We live in a world of soft and warm. Theirs was a world of hard, cold, and intense. Without fire to dull the flavors or soften the textures, every meal was a sensory explosion. The metallic tang of raw blood, the earthy, bitter grit of a pounded tuber, the crunch of chitinous insect shells, and the sharp, acidic funk of naturally fermented fruit. They tasted the world in high definition because they had to. Bitterness was a warning of poison. Sweetness was a rare and precious miracle. This sensory intensity was the feedback loop that kept them alive. We have traded that intensity for safety and convenience, but that raw, primal feedback system is still buried deep in our DNA, waiting to be triggered. If we were to go back, would we find their world more alive than our own? It's easy to look back with pity on those millions of years spent in the cold, but that's a mistake born of our own modern comfort. The pre-fire diet was the furnace in which the human spirit was forged. It demanded a level of cooperation that we struggle to find today. Because food was so hard to process and so dangerous to acquire, you couldn't survive alone. You needed a group to help pound the tubers, a group to watch for predators while you butchered a scavenged kill, and a group to share the high-fat bounty of a bone marrow haul before it went bad. The social contract of humanity was written in raw meat and shared insects. We didn't become social creatures because we liked each other. We became social because the raw world was too heavy for one person to chew. Is it possible that fire, by making food easier to handle, actually made us more individualistic? Think about the sheer amount of time that fire gave us. If you spend 8 hours a day chewing, you don't have time for cave painting, tool innovation, or complex storytelling. Fire didn't just provide calories, it provided time. It condensed the labor of a full day into a 30-minute meal. This surplus of time is what allowed human culture to explode. But the foundations of that culture, the sharing, the tool-making, the strategic thinking, were already there, hardened by 2 million years of raw struggle. We aren't the children of the flame. We are the graduates of the raw. The trick of the fire question is that it makes us look for a before and after moment, a single point where we became human. But the truth is that our humanity was built in the before. It was built in the long, dark stretch of time when we had nothing but a sharp stone and the courage to eat what the rest of the world couldn't. What does it say about us that our greatest technology was something we didn't even need for the first 90% of our history? It says that we are a species defined by our flexibility. We are the only primate that can move between diets, environments, and technologies with such ease. We went from scavengers eating lion leftovers to farmers to astronauts in the blink of an evolutionary eye. And through all of it, we have carried the remnants of that raw world with us. We carry it in our high stomach acidity, in our small guts, and in our deep, instinctive craving for fat and protein. When you eat a meal today, you are utilizing a digestive system that was designed for a world of raw tubers and scavenged antelope, but you are fueling it with the easy energy of the post-fire era. We are biological Ferraris being driven in a parking lot. Does this disconnect between our ancient hardware and our modern software explain the health crises of the 21st century? Maybe the myth isn't that the raw diet was better, but that we are finished evolving. We are still in the middle of the transition. We are still adapting to the gift of fire, even as we move on to the next great dietary shift. The pre-fire era reminds us that we are not fragile creatures. We are the survivors of a 2 million-year gauntlet that would break any other animal on Earth. We ate the world raw, and we didn't just survive, we grew. We grew brains that were too big for our bodies and a curiosity that was too big for our planet. And it all started with a cold, wet piece of muscle and a heavy stone in a dark valley. How often do you think about the fact that your very existence is a miracle of raw endurance? If you ever find yourself looking at the paleo section of a grocery store, or hearing someone talk about the natural way for humans to live, remember the Afar Depression. Remember the sound of stone on bone and the intense, acidic burn of a stomach designed to eat things that would turn a modern stomach inside out. The natural state of humanity isn't a clean, organized kitchen or a wood-fired grill. It is a messy, dangerous, and incredibly sophisticated negotiation with the raw power of nature. We are the descendants of the toughest, most adaptable scavengers to ever walk the earth. Fire was a shortcut, a brilliant and world-changing hack that allowed us to step into the light. But the strength to walk into that light was built in the dark, one difficult, raw, and unflavored mouthful at a time. The next time you sit down to a warm, cooked meal, take a second to realize what a luxury that actually is. You aren't just eating food. You are using a technology that revolutionized the very meaning of being alive. But beneath that heat, and beneath that softness, the ancient, raw-eating hominin is still there, looking out through your eyes. Look at your own reflection and realize that your body is a walking museum of a time when we were not the masters of the world, but its most desperate and brilliant opportunists. We did not just survive the raw world, we consumed it until it gave us the strength to build a better one. And in that transition, we left behind a version of ourselves that we can now barely comprehend. A version that lived by the rule of the raw and thrived in the face of impossible odds. That version of you is still there, buried under layers of civilization and cooked calories, a silent reminder that we were never meant to be comfortable. You're a biological machine that was designed to thrive on the absolute edge of disaster. There is a deep, unsettling truth in the fact that our ancestors survived for millions of years, eating things that would kill you today, and they did it with a fraction of your technology. It forces us to ask, what else have we lost in the name of comfort? And what primal strengths are we still carrying that we've completely forgotten how to use? If the story of our diet reveals anything, it's that we are far more dangerous and far more resilient than we give ourselves credit for. We are the species that ate the impossible, and we aren't done yet. Your ancestors spent 2 million years in the cold so that you could eventually have the luxury of complaining about your lunch being lukewarm. Take a moment to reflect on the sheer mechanical and biological effort that went into your genetic survival before we ever mastered the flame. If you find these deep dives into the hidden corners of our history as fascinating as I do, consider joining our community by subscribing. We have many more forgotten chapters to uncover together. What part of the ancient menu surprised you the most? Or what myth about the paleo life do you still see being repeated? Let's talk about it in the comments. We are the only animals on this planet that can look back at our own evolution and understand the price that was paid for our modern world. The story of what we ate before fire isn't just about food. It's about the relentless, grinding process of becoming who we are. It's a story of grit, of bacteria, of stone tools, and of a gut that had to be as tough as the world around it. We are the children of the raw. And we should never forget the struggle of the millions of years that happened before the first fire was ever lit. You are the end result of a survival strategy that was never supposed to work. Everything you are today is built on the cold, hard, and bloody foundation of a world that didn't care if you were hungry. OPDT.06